already signed it, Eleanor. From now on, this house is no longer mine. That moment happened on a very quiet evening in the kitchen, when the wall clock made a dry clicking sound, as if someone had just marked the beat for something already decided. I was standing at the sink, the yellow light spilling onto the worn wooden countertop, the smell of stew still hanging in the air. I wiped my hands on my apron even though they weren't dirty, an old reflex of someone used to asking permission to exist, used to making everything look neat before speaking. Those words came from my mother after a family dinner that seemed perfectly ordinary. We had just finished cleaning up, plates stacked neatly, knives and forks aligned in the same direction. My father folded his napkin and placed it on the table. Just like always. No one raised their voice. No one showed any anger. That calmness was exactly what made my mother's words land heavier. If one day you realize you no longer have a place in your own family, what would you do? I used to think that question was meant for someone else. For late-night television stories people watch when they can't sleep. But when it happened to me, I understood that the fear wasn't about losing a house. The fear was the feeling of being replaced, of being treated as temporary, a feeling painfully familiar to women who have spent their entire lives keeping things intact for others. There are families that don't push you out. They just slowly make you disappear. I stood there, listening to my heartbeat slow, as if my body were trying to stretch out the moment before acceptance. I looked around the kitchen, the place where I once did my homework, learned how to cook my first chicken soup, hung my keys on the hook every night. Everything was still there, but the sense of belonging was gone. Have you ever stayed silent just so you could stay? I have. Many times. I stayed silent when conversations happened without me, silent when documents were slid across the table with reassuring smiles, silent when others spoke for me, decided for me, and called it for the family. I thought silence was how you kept the peace. I thought being understanding was how you earned love. If you're listening to this story late at night, maybe in a quiet living room or in bed after everyone else has fallen asleep, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. Some long nights only need to know you're not listening alone. The story you are about to hear was assisted by AI and edited by humans, created to offer reflection and understanding. It does not encourage anyone to follow it, only hopes to help you get through a long night with empathy. That night, I stood in that kitchen for a long time. I didn't argue. I didn't ask any questions. I just nodded, out of a habit deeply ingrained. At the time, I didn't know that signature wouldn't be the only one I ever put down for my family. After that night, I began to look back on the previous years the way someone flips through an old notebook. Not to find fault, but to understand how I ended up here. I was always the easy one. Praised from a young age for being sensible, not causing trouble, not talking back. At family gatherings, when everyone spoke at once, I was usually the quietest. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I believed my silence helped everything pass smoothly. There were times when documents were placed in front of me, along with a pen and the familiar words, "Just sign here." I skimmed them, trusting that if something mattered, they would tell me. I gave my social security number when asked, sent copies of documents when requested, nodded instead of arguing because I thought arguments only tired people out. Each time, I told myself I was helping the family, that trust was a good thing. I remember clearly one afternoon many years ago, sunlight pouring through the living room window, dust floating like tiny specks in the air. My mother sat across from me, straightening a thick stack of files, then said lightly, as if reminding me to bring a jacket because it was cold, "You're a daughter. You don't need to keep these kinds of papers." I smiled as if it were concern. I left the folder on the table and stood up to make tea. Looking back now, I wonder why I believed that so easily. Why I never asked, if I don't keep them, then who does? I didn't search for an answer right away. I just felt something strange slide across my chest, like the moment you realize you've grown used to stepping aside to make room. So much so that you forget you're allowed to stand in the middle too. My family was used to deciding for me, not through pressure, but through habit. They were used to speaking for me, signing for me, arranging things for me, and calling it concern. I was used to letting them and calling it harmony. No one fought. No one took anything by force, just a slow current where I gradually drifted out without ever hearing the sound of water. There are families that don't take things from you. They simply accept them because they assume you won't hold on. When that thought surfaced in my mind, I didn't feel angry. I felt a low, persistent unease, like a faint buzzing you only hear when a room is completely silent. I began to realize that my silences had been interpreted as agreement, and that agreement, even unspoken, had cleared the path for decisions that no longer carried my name. That night, I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the familiar ceiling, listening to the wind slip through the crack in the door. There was no climax, just a sense of something being off, slowly but surely, and I knew I could no longer pretend not to see it. That afternoon, I drove home as the sun was sinking low, the last light stretching across the familiar road in front of the house. The key slid smoothly into the lock, the soft turn of metal just like every other day. The door opened, but the feeling of being welcomed was gone. Not because someone was waiting inside, but because the air itself felt different in a way I couldn't quite name. I stepped into the living room and looked around slowly. The armchair that used to be angled slightly toward the window had been pushed against the wall, as if to create more open space in the center. On the shelf, family photo frames were turned at slight angle, not replaced, just no longer facing the spot where I usually sat. Even the smell of the room was different. Not exactly unfamiliar, just missing the familiar scent of the soap I used, the candle I lit every night. I stood there for a few seconds, telling myself I was being overly sensitive. Maybe they just rearranged things to make it neater. That's what I thought, and I smiled at myself for letting small details shake me. My family always liked things tidy. They were just trying to help. I repeated those familiar lines as if they were enough to make everything feel settled again. I reached out and turned on the living room light. The ceiling light spread instantly, bright, leaving no corner dark. But it didn't feel warm. It felt like turning on the lights in a model home, bright, clean, and empty. I stood still in the middle of the room, my hand still on the switch, as if waiting for the house to send back some familiar signal. A soft creak of wood, an old scent, anything to tell me I still belonged here. I remembered how for years I was always the last one to clean up, the one who straightened chairs, adjusted pillows, wiped down the table before bed. I didn't do those things to be praised, but because I thought that was how you kept everything smooth. Standing there in that brightly lit but cold room, I wondered when I stopped being the center of this space, when the house stopped responding to my presence. My gaze landed on the wooden table near the window. On it was a new stack of papers, neatly aligned, the edges still crisp, as if they'd been placed there not long ago. I knew I'd never seen them before. I stepped closer and gently lifted the top page. They weren't my personal documents, but every line was directly related to this house. I held the stack in my hands, the paper cold against my skin. Only then did I realize what made my chest feel heavy wasn't the small changes, but the truth lying quietly on those pages. A decision had already been made, neatly, silently, before I had a chance to speak. I sat down on the chair by the window, set the papers aside, and pulled out my phone, out of habit, whenever my mind needed something solid to hold on to. The screen lit up in my palm, pale blue light reflecting off the glass. A chain of emails sat at the top of my inbox, the subject lines mentioning the house in very dry terms. I opened one, unhurried, as if reading slowly might make it less heavy. My name wasn't listed as a primary recipient. I scrolled up, then down, checking again just to be sure. It wasn't there. The email talked about transfer of responsibility, new point of contact, a joint family decision. Every sentence was carefully written, polite, like an administrative notice sent to the relevant parties. It was just that I was no longer considered one of them. I read each line slowly, searching for something that might suggest my name had simply been left out by mistake. Maybe it was sent to the wrong list. Maybe it was just a draft. I invented small possibilities to delay what was becoming clear, but the more I read, the more orderly and precise it was, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Then my eyes stopped on a short line, sitting quietly among the longer paragraphs. Primary contact. Mother. My name was completely gone, as if it had never existed in this story at all. A chill ran down my spine, not from anger, but from realizing that something had been established without my consent. In that moment, I understood I hadn't been excluded because I'd done something wrong. I'd been excluded because I hadn't objected for too long. My silence, my easy nods, had become precedent. They were used to me not speaking up, and in that space, they learned how to move forward without asking. I remembered being praised for being no trouble, easy to work with, compliments that once made me feel relieved, as if I'd done the right thing. Now they surfaced in my mind with a different tone, slick and cold, like labels stuck onto me a long time ago. My chest felt empty, not aching, just hollow, like a room that had just been cleared out. I wasn't angry. I didn't want to cry. I just sat there, watching the late afternoon light spill across the tabletop, and felt clearly the emptiness where I once believed I belonged. It hadn't vanished suddenly. It had simply been quietly filled with decisions that didn't include me. There are families that don't need to push you out. They just keep living without needing your voice. I set my phone down and took a slow breath. For the first time, a thought appeared clearly in my mind, not loud, not impulsive. I would talk to someone who didn't share my last name. I made plans to meet an old acquaintance the next afternoon at a small cafe near downtown, a place office workers often stop by before heading home. We weren't close, hadn't shared personal lives in a long time, but that was exactly what made me feel safe. No family history, no obligation to protect anyone, just enough space for me to speak honestly. The cafe was quiet, the steady sound of the coffee machine behind the counter. I sat across from them, both hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, letting the warmth spread into my palms. I told everything in the order I remembered, without embellishing, without making myself seem more pitiable. I didn't ask who they thought was right or wrong. I just told it, like laying pieces on a table to see their shape clearly. They listened for a long time. No interruptions, no excessive nodding, no rushing to give advice the way I'd expected. There were stretches of silence, long enough for me to hear a spoon tap against a cup at the next table. In those silences, I realized I was waiting for something, not defense, but acknowledgement that what I felt was real. When I finished, they took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down slowly. Silence isn't neutral, they said, their voice steady and low, as if speaking to themselves. It always sides with the stronger party. The sentence wasn't loud, but it landed on the table between us with a strange weight. I opened my mouth, ready to argue out of habit, then stopped. I couldn't find a reason to deny it, because somewhere inside me that truth had already existed. I sat still, feeling as if an invisible cord had just been loosened from my chest. I suddenly realized that in all the times I talked about my family, I had never once said, "I'm not okay." I said, "Everything will be fine," said, "It's just a misunderstanding," said, "It's family stuff." I used vague phrases to cover something very specific, the feeling of being pushed to the margins. "I'm not okay," I said for the first time, not loudly, not shaking. I didn't cry. I didn't explain further. The sentence didn't need the listener to fully understand. It just needed to be spoken, to exist in the air between us. The person across from me didn't respond right away, only nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a truth that had just been placed there. When I stood up to leave, the sky had darkened. Streetlights reflected on car windows in long streaks. I didn't have a new plan, no clear solution. But I carried a very different feeling from when I had walked into the cafe, something unfamiliar, both empty and sharp. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew something had changed. I had spoken my truth, and that alone made my steps feel lighter. That night, when I returned home and sat down at the small desk by the window, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in a long time. Inside were stacks of papers I'd put away thinking I'd deal with them later. I began to go through them, for the first time not asking my family, not texting ahead, not waiting for someone to help me understand. The room was so quiet I could clearly hear the soft rustle of paper with every turn. Each sheet felt like a piece of my life I had handed to someone else for safekeeping. There were copies I'd forgotten I ever signed, familiar lines appearing in what was clearly my own handwriting, yet the feeling was distant. I read slowly, giving myself time to notice what I'd overlooked for years. The clauses, dates, and signatures sat neatly on the page, not vague at all, despite what I'd told myself. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that many decisions had been prepared in advance. Not rushed, not impulsive, but carefully arranged steps, waiting only for the final signature to be complete. I stopped at one page and stared at the date printed in the top corner. It was the day we'd all eaten dinner together, laughed a lot, taken photos on the front porch, a family gathering so warm that I remember thinking everything would be fine. Realizing that coincidence made my chest feel heavy. The smiles from that day surfaced in my memory, bright and clear, but now they carried a different shade. I understood then that joy and honesty don't always travel together. Some decisions are made in comfortable settings, so the person affected doesn't realize in time what they're losing. There are decisions made in laughter, so the person affected doesn't realize what they've just lost. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. I wondered if, that day, I had said, "Let me think about it." Would things have been different? If I had asked for more time, asked one more question, if I hadn't nodded so quickly. Those questions didn't come to punish me, but to illuminate one thing clearly. I had grown used to making things easy, even when the cost was my own agency. I don't blame myself. I understand I did what I thought was right at the time. But I also know I can't keep covering for that ease anymore. The silence that once made me feel safe now only makes me fade in my own life. I stacked the papers again and set them neatly on the table. In that moment, I knew one thing clearly, without needing to say it out loud. I couldn't go back to my old role without losing myself. We sat down together again on another evening, around that same familiar table. There was no obvious tension. No one raised their voice. I came with a strange calm, not because everything was okay, but because I had gone far enough to see it from the outside. I didn't bring the papers, I didn't bring proof. I brought only one question, and I said it slowly, as if I didn't want to scratch the fragile surface of the room. Why didn't anyone tell me beforehand? The question dropped onto the dining table among the undisturbed plates in the steam of freshly poured tea. No one answered right away. The silence stretched. Awkwardness wasn't the word. It was heavy. My father looked down at the tabletop, his hand resting on his napkin. My younger siblings shifted in their seat. My mother slowly set her cup down, the sound of porcelain against wood loud inside that empty space. "We thought you'd understand," my mother finally said, her voice even and soft, like an explanation meant to be enough for something already done. That sentence didn't shock me. It only confirmed what I'd felt for a long time. No one in that room was trying to apologize. They didn't deny what had happened, but they also didn't see a reason to regret it. In the way they sat, in the way they exhaled with relief after my mother spoke, I understood that to them, everything had been resolved the moment the decision was made. I looked at each of them, not to assign blame, but to take note. I could see clearly that I had never been the one making decisions in things that were called shared. I was the one informed afterward, the one expected to adapt, to understand, to keep the air smooth the way I always had. Realizing that didn't hurt more. It only made everything brighter. I didn't argue, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I understood that arguing now would only help me keep my old role, the understanding daughter, the one who could always be persuaded that everything was for the common good. I didn't want to keep playing that role. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair in neatly out of a habit that was hard to break. "I need time," I said, not looking at anyone in particular. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a demand. It was simply a sentence that confirmed my choice. For the first time, without asking permission, without waiting for anyone to nod. No one stopped me. No one walked me to the door. When I stepped outside, the cool night air touched my skin, and I took a deeper breath than usual. In that moment, I knew I had made my final choice for myself. Not to abandon anyone, but to stop abandoning myself. I left that house early one morning, before the sunlight had warmed the front steps. No anger guided me. I didn't pack in a rush, and I didn't try to create a moment to remember. Everything moved slowly, as if I were returning a book I'd finished, knowing I didn't need to keep another page. No one stopped me. No one saw me off. Inside the house, the familiar sounds of morning continued, water running in the sink, a cabinet door closing softly. I walked through the living room, glanced at objects that had once been tied to me, and kept moving. I didn't want leaving to become a statement. I just wanted it to be a choice. I paused by the key hook beside the door, where I'd placed my keys every night for years. My hand hesitated for the smallest beat, long enough for me to realize I wasn't doing this because anyone pushed me. I set the key ring down so gently the metal made no sound, no explanation, no note. The moment passed quickly, but I knew it would stay with me longer than any argument ever could. When I stepped outside, I closed the door behind me carefully, as if I still wanted things to remain orderly. That was when I understood what made me so calm. I wasn't leaving because they were wrong. I was leaving because I finally knew what I needed. That difference, small as it was, changed the entire feeling inside me. It turned leaving from a loss into an intentional choice. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the morning air. I thought about how staying had once been a choice too, a choice I had made for a very long time. But that choice no longer fit the person I was becoming. Realizing that didn't make me sad. It only made everything clearer, like adjusting the brightness until you finally see the true color of a room. I took very little with me: a bag of clothes, a few books, the desk lamp I loved. Nothing symbolic, no treasured keepsakes. And yet, when I put the bag in the trunk, I felt lighter than I expected. Not because I left so much behind, but because I no longer had to carry what I didn't choose. I got into the driver's seat and started the car. The road ahead felt familiar and strange at the same time, stretched out in the slowly rising light. I didn't know what the future would look like. I didn't map out a plan in that moment. I only knew one thing clearly, and that was enough for that morning. I chose for real, and this time I chose for myself. Time moved differently after that day. I moved into a new space, much smaller than the old house, but everything inside it felt clear. Morning light fell straight onto the kitchen table. The sound of traffic outside was far enough away that it didn't make me flinch. I knew exactly where I was every evening, and that feeling, simple as it was, made me feel steady. I didn't receive any more emails about the old house. No long threads, no subject lines about a shared decision. My phone stayed quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. No one asked my opinion, and no one pulled me into half-finished conversations. At first, that quiet made me uneasy, as if I had missed something. But then I realized I wasn't being forgotten. I was simply no longer inside the spiral I used to call connection. One afternoon, while clearing out old voicemails to free up storage, I accidentally opened one from years ago. My voice in it was small and cautious, words chosen carefully as if I were asking permission to speak. I listened back, standing still in the middle of the room, and realized how much I had shrunk myself to fit other people's expectations. It was a moment that made me stop, not from pain, but from a soft, quiet kind of tenderness. I didn't blame the people from before. I didn't try to understand them more. Instead, my attention turned toward the version of me in that recording. Someone who tried her best not to inconvenience anyone, not to disrupt anything, even when that meant making herself smaller. Thinking that, I closed the voicemail. I didn't delete it. I just moved it into a different folder, the way you carefully set a memory down. I began to rebuild my life on my own rhythm, not through big decisions, but through small changes. I ate dinner earlier. I left my desk lamp on longer while I read. I stayed quiet when I didn't want to explain, and I spoke when I needed to. New boundaries formed, without any announcement, just through the simple fact that I stopped stepping into spaces that were no longer meant for me. I didn't take revenge. I didn't try to reclaim what was already gone. I set boundaries through action, through fully showing up in the life I chose to stay in. And slowly, I realized the silence around me had changed color. It was no longer the painful emptiness of being left behind. It became a quiet space, wide enough for me to breathe, calm enough for me to hear myself. Silence no longer made me shrink. It opened slowly and warm, like a morning that doesn't need an alarm. I stopped thinking of boundaries as cruelty. I used to fear that every time I said no, I would hurt someone, crack the family atmosphere. Now I understand a boundary is simply the way I say yes to myself, at the right time and in the right place. I didn't win against anyone in this story. I simply stopped losing myself, stopped accepting fading out to keep things peaceful, stopped trading my presence for approval. My family didn't change. They still lived their way, with familiar decisions and familiar silences. What changed was me. I no longer stood in a position where I had to guess how far I was allowed to go. I stood where I chose, on my own feet. The old house was gone, but I had a place to stand. A place that didn't require permission, didn't require explanation, didn't require being understood in order to exist. One weekend morning, I hung a new photo on the blank wall of my small apartment. Not a family photo, not a formal moment, just a picture I'd taken through the window, light slanting across a wooden table, a cup sitting exactly where I like it. When it was in place, I stepped back, looked at it, and smiled. There's no ceremony for coming back to yourself. There are only ordinary, lived actions like that. The story you just heard is fictional, inspired by real-life situations and very human experiences. The content was assisted by AI and edited by humans, with the hope of offering reflection and emotional value, not to encourage anyone to follow any actions in the story. Everyone has their own circumstances, their own pace, and their own choices. What I took from it is only a personal feeling. Sometimes what we think is loss is just the outer layer of growth arriving. If there's a small gift I can leave you with through this story, it's a gentle reminder. You don't have to disappear in order to stay. You deserve to be fully present in the place you choose. Before we close, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening to this story right now? In a quiet living room, in the kitchen with the lights off, or in a car parked silently out front? What time is it where you are? Thank you for staying until the end, for giving your time to a slow, honest story. If this story touched you or made you think of someone you love, share it in your own way. If you connected with it, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so we can meet again in other long nights. And if you're listening in a quiet moment, remember this: you're not alone.